Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Excellent. So maybe we'll give it another just minute or two, and then I'll get started with introductions, and we'll have our session. All right. I think I see all four of our student presenters in the room already. That's good. All right, so why don't we get started? Thank you, everyone, for coming to this session on racial injustice, sexism, and success for all in the US. My name is Patrick Fazioli. I'm the co-director of the Global Honors Program at Mercy College, and I'm going to be moderating this session. So we have four student presenters in this session. They are, and I apologize if I butcher your name, Dzifa Amexo, Crystal Wojcik, Schill, and Chibuzo Opaigbeogu. Is that close enough? This is how this is going to go. The presentations are going to be roughly 10 minutes in length, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions afterwards. For the presenters, I will send you a private message on the chat when you have about 2 minutes left or so. And if at the end of the presentation, people are welcome to unmute themselves and ask questions, or if you want to just send me a question in the chat at any point, I will be happy to ask it for you. So does anyone have any questions or concerns before we get started today? All right, sounds good. So our first presenter today is Dzifa Amexo from Mercy College. Welcome, Dzifa. Her presentation is entitled, "Do Black Lives Matter to Corporate America? Brand Activism, Woke Washing, and Representation in the Boardroom." Dzifa, I don't think you could have picked a more sort of topical presentation for this very moment with the stuff that's happening in Georgia right now. So we're all very excited to hear your presentation, and I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Fazioli. Let me just share my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. Alrighty, I'm assuming everyone can see my screen. Good morning, everyone. Happy Saturday. I'm super excited to be here today and be presenting on my research topic, which is entitled Walking the Talk. I attend Mercy College, class of 2020/2021. And like I said, I'm really excited to talk about this topic. It's a large passion of mine, and I'm just excited to get started. So, how many times have any of you heard the phrase "actions speak louder than words"? You can type in the chat or give me a thumbs up. I won't be able to see it, but just striving for some interactivity. So that's a really common quote that my mom used to tell me growing up: "Your actions speak louder than your words." On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, was brutally murdered by a white police officer who kneeled on his neck for almost 9 minutes. From there, protests had erupted worldwide, setting world records. George Floyd was a marker. He was also a father, a friend, a son, but he wasn't the first of many. There was Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, but this seemed like it was the first time that people couldn't pretend to be too busy to ignore what was happening in our country. From then on, celebrities and everyday people started posting Black squares on Instagram, hashtagging Blackout Tuesday to show their support for the matter. This ended up not going as planned, as it turned out to be a disruption to the Black Lives Matter movement as they were posting vital information on this hashtag. But from there, this idea of performative activism or slacktivism really started to emerge as a prominent idea, right? Because there's two different things besides, it's one thing to post on Instagram, but it's another thing to actually take some concrete action and put that behind your words. And so obviously this past summer was a just a trying time. There was COVID, which was also disproportionately killing Black and brown people. And then we had this, and it was just a lot going on. But from there, like celebrities and everyday people, companies decided to speak out. They were saying Black Lives Matter, diversity is at the utmost important for our firms. But the thing that really stood out to me was that why are these companies speaking out now? Why weren't they speaking out in 2013 when Trayvon Martin was murdered? Why weren't they speaking out in 2015 after Sandra Bland was murdered? Why now? What made this time so special? So the research question that I decided to research is, do Black lives really matter in corporate America? And so the idea behind this is to really uncover whether or not these companies are being authentic in their support for diversity and inclusion, and just showing that they really value Black lives in the community. So let's first take a look at the numbers. More than 90% of Fortune 100 companies have a formal commitment to employee diversity displayed on their websites and 10K reports. Yet, women and ethnic minorities continue to be underrepresented in the executive ranks of US corporations. So I have a few quick statistics over here that really support that original statement, right? So again, companies are saying diversity is so important to us, but then when you look at their numbers, it's telling a completely different story. In the 66-year history of the Fortune 500, there have only been 17 Black CEOs in total, with a peak of 6 Black CEOs in 2012. Additionally, Black professionals held just 3.3% of all executive or senior leadership roles in 2018. And up until recently, which I am so excited to announce and change that, this fact is now like a little bit outdated, but Ursula Burns was previously the only Black female full-time CEO to ever lead a Fortune 500 company. Since then, so I conducted my research in the fall of 2020. We're now in 2021. And since then, 2 Black females have been announced to become the next CEO of 2 major large corporations, that being TIAA and Walgreens. So this is really exciting to see that some companies are already taking tangible actions and really matching the words. But just looking a little bit further, Black women account for 7.4% of the US population, yet only 1.6% of VP roles and 1.4% of C-suite positions. And just as a whole, Black professionals account for only 3% of CEOs, 1% of CFOs, and 3% of profit leaders like division presidents. And so from there, I really wanted to understand, why are these brands speaking out about issues that some might call social or political, but to be honest, they're really human rights issues that we should all be caring about. But I really wanted to understand what was the motivation behind these brands speaking out. And so it led me to this idea of brand activism, which is basically the idea that brands take a stance on a social or political act. And the reason behind this is because they ultimately want to appeal to their consumers. And so as a fellow Gen Z person, along with millennials, we really care about what's happening to the earth. And unlike maybe some of the other generations, we place that as a priority, and we really want to make this world a better place. And so companies see that we are really involved in social causes and social issues and things like that. So in order for these companies to gain our attention and our loyalty, they really have to appeal to this sense of social issues and social justice and issues, so on and so forth. And so all this leads to 69% of all millennials worldwide who are driven by these values and beliefs during their purchase. So essentially, the brands are really just creating the brands to be almost like a human persona, right? So you can feel attached to these brands. We can say that, oh, okay, Ben & Jerry supports Black Lives Matter. Like, I see them as a person, and they have attributes that I align with. And so this is really one of the primary factors between brand activism and what's motivating people or brands to speak out. And so the goal is for brands to be seen as woke, which has become a sort of trendy term on social media in the past few years. And that just basically means that companies are aware of what's going on in the world and in particular to social issues. And so if you do brand activism the right way, that can be seen as you being woke or authentic. And as consumers, we love that, right? We want to have that trust between ourselves and the brand. But if it's done incorrectly, it can lead to something called woke washing, which is basically inauthentically showing your values. So an example of woke washing, I'll go into a few later on in the presentation. But for example, if you say one thing and then your actions show another thing, right? I'm not going to be inclined to believe what you're saying because you're telling me two different stories. So there's this fine line between being woke or woke washing, and it's really led to a lack of trust in terms of consumers. So much so that 56% of consumers view statements as a marketing tactic rather than authentic support for a cause, right? So this causes a problem because if consumers aren't viewing the brand's authentic support for issues as authentic, then they're not going to have that trust and they're really not going to buy into the brand and the products. So knowing all of this, the bulk of my research really was around going and taking a look at a sample of companies to see what they've actually done since 2016 and see what they've said and done in 2020. So the idea behind this was I wanted to randomly select 4 companies from a variety of industries. So we have Ben & Jerry's, consumer goods, Goldman Sachs, that's the finance industry, AT&T, which is more telecommunications and tech, and Nike, which is of course consumer goods and clothing apparel. And so what I really wanted to see and why I chose 2016 was because of course the Black Lives Matter movement was founded in 2013, but in 2016 there was a similar peak as was in the summer of 2020. So I wanted to see, okay, early on in 2016 there still wasn't a lot of support, but it was a perceived peak. So I wanted to see if these companies had spoken out then, what they've done since then, and then now take a look at 2020 to see, are your words matching your actions, and so on and so forth. So the first company that I looked at was Ben & Jerry's, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the ice cream company. This is the only ice cream that I eat. I don't buy any other brand. I love it. The flavors are amazing. But when you look at Ben & Jerry's, the way that they've structured their business as a B Corp, which basically means that they have like a portion of their proceeds that go to social causes, and they're really down for the cause. In 2016, they had spoken out about Black Lives Matter, and they made a whole blog post, and it was not just a PR piece, it was very to the point, and they were using words that a lot of people weren't using at the time. And since then, since 2016 and 2020, they made a statement, but since then, in between, they've partnered with a lot of organizations, and they've partnered with Colin Kaepernick, who's a prominent figure in the movement, as well as the fact that they've just really lived their values, right? So they're saying Black Lives Matter, and they've shown that through their actions and their donations. Goldman Sachs, on the other hand, in 2016, one of their prominent managers had spoken out about who was Black, and she spoke out about her experiences and how this is very important to the firm. But at the time, there were no statements made by the CEO. So to me, that just was a little bit conflicting because if everyone is really believing this in the organization, you would think that there would be an official statement from the CEO. In 2020, Goldman Sachs, the new CEO, had made a statement and wrote a letter and shared it. And in addition, they had created a 10 billion fund to help invest in the Black community and Black entrepreneurs. And since then, they've added to that fund. So they've really been trying to improve their stance. But again, we kind of have that conflicting message. And additionally, when they had spoken out in 2020, one of their directors had come out and said, and shared their experiences and made a note about how junior bankers don't feel as supported, who are from a diverse background. So that's also kind of conflicting. AT&T in 2016, their prior CEO had spoken out. He gave this huge TED talk about how Black Lives Matter is super important in the workplace. And then since then, they have invested upwards of about 12 million, which is great. They spoke out again in 2020, but there was also a group of Black employees that spoke out about how they felt like they were being mistreated, just in terms of COVID and protection and the right to unionize and things like that. So again, we're seeing that story where they're saying diversity inclusion is so important, but their actions are telling a different story. Nike, on the other hand, they have shown their support in 2016, and they've really been honest about their diversity numbers. So they're one of the few organizations that are public about their diversity percentages. And one of the things that they said is that our numbers are not where they're supposed to be. So while Nike has had some positive moments, some controversial moments, they've really been honest about their position and where they are in this journey. And so that's one thing that we can respect. And additionally, they have invested 40 million over a 4-year commitment, and Michael Jordan added about 10 million to that investment. So you can see here that Ben & Jerry's and Nike really stand out by either living their values or owning their position. On the other hand, you have Goldman Sachs and AT&T in the middle. So where do we go from here? Change, unfortunately, does not happen overnight, but there are so many things that these companies, in my opinion, can be doing. And so the next steps that I think that companies should be taking in order to really walk the talk is to create an action plan that really centers around the Black experience. The next thing, which I think is probably the most important thing, is to share the data in terms of diversity numbers and reports. I think it's really important to be able to have that, because if you're trying to change something, you can't really manage what you're not measuring. So of course, well, hopefully some companies are internally measuring their diversity, but a lot of them don't publicly release it. And it's really important for us as consumers to be able to hold these firms accountable. And so in order for that to happen, we need them to share their diversity data. The next thing is to focus on inclusion. And this is just really focusing on the point that diversity is not the same as inclusion, right? Companies need to strive for that inclusivity in their companies, not just having 10 Black employees and saying that they are doing great in diversity and inclusion. And the last thing, which is probably the most important, is to be authentic. Obviously, none of us are perfect, but there is a lot to be said about being honest about where you are and not trying to portray that you are woke when you're really not. Because I think that as consumers, now that we know that we have the power to really understand what companies are doing and use our dollars to either support companies we want to or not support companies that we don't want to. And so at the end of the day, this is a movement. It's not a moment. It didn't start in June 2020, and it's not yet over. Every day is a new day. And I think we all need to be willing to contribute to this change, and Black Lives Matter. Thank you very much. These are my resources. I just want to briefly share since then. So I wrote this paper in the fall of 2020. For another capstone, I decided to take a look at the tech industry and analyze their statements in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement. And since then, I'm currently working on creating some sort of database that really looks at the Fortune 500 companies and whether or not they release their data and how that matches up. Because like I said, I think data is really important, and having a centralized location that can allow consumers to really hold these companies accountable and really track and measure their changes, I think would be really important in moving this movement forward. Thank you. Stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Dzifa. Yes, let's virtual round of applause. And yes, so again, I see Dean Gibson, you have a question.
No, I just wanted to say, first of all, Dzifa, wonderful job. I also had the privilege of seeing her presentation she did for her capstone class that she mentioned, and it was an awesome presentation, just like this. I did want to say your enthusiasm, as you said about being authentic, your enthusiasm is infectious, and it's very important. And I'm very proud to say that you were one of our students. So I just wanted to pass that on to you. But I wonder, why pick the 4 companies that you did for this particular presentation?
Thank you, Dean Gibson. I appreciate it.
If I don't know if you heard the last part of Dean
Last
Gibson.
part.
Oh, no, I didn't. Sorry.
Sorry.
I heard the ending, and then I heard thank you for the presentation, but was there a question? No, I'm sorry. My earphones had cut out for a second.
Oh, no problem. A lot of this happens all the time in these circumstances. Now, my question was, why pick those 4 particular companies? And when you looked at Ben & Jerry's being one of them, and I understand about the ice cream and how great it is, but Ben & Jerry's has changed over time too. And I was curious if you noticed anything there, because when they started out as an independent company, of course, they ran the company probably a little differently than it's run now. Not saying it's bad or anything like that, but I just wondered if you noticed any difference in them over a longer period of time.
Yeah, so initially I really wanted to, it was kind of randomly selected, but also I really wanted kind of four, or at least two standout companies where I could say, this is an example of someone who's authentic and really living their values versus like the others. So there could be a good comparison. In terms of Ben & Jerry's, like, so originally, right, they were just by themselves and they were acquired by Unilever. There were some differences, but for the most part, I read a ton of articles about how the founders are really passionate about just like the social aspect of Ben & Jerry's, right? They were founded as a B Corp. And of course, some things have changed, but they're really fighting to stay true to their values and really just focus on that. So even though they've changed, they've evolved, they've still kept true to their values from day one. And I think that's kind of what differentiates Ben & Jerry's from other companies, right? So you have other companies that are changing, but Ben & Jerry's from the jump, they said, this is what we're doing, this is what we're here for. If you like it, great. If you don't, that's okay. While other companies have kind of taken more of a middle ground approach.
Thank you. So I think in the interest of time, if anyone else has a question for Dzifa, maybe you could just put it in the chat, or you can hold on to the end. If we have a little bit of time at the end of the session, we can have a sort of like a general questions for all the presenters. But thank you again, Dzifa. That was wonderful way to start the session. And now we're going to move to Crystal Wojcik from the Massachusetts College of the Liberal Arts. And her presentation is entitled "One Step Forward and Three Steps Back: Women in the Workplace During a Global Pandemic." Crystal, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm assuming everybody can see my screen. So my presentation is focused on women in the workplace during a global pandemic. I worked with Dr. Thomas Whaling at MCLA. He is actually getting his COVID shot today, so he couldn't be here, but he was excited to see me present. And my name's Crystal. I'm a senior at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts, and I'm a business major with a focus in accounting. So a quick outline of what we're going to cover today. I'll give a brief background of women in the workplace, and I'll cover how the pandemic is reinstating gender roles within workplaces and in home lives. I'll define the difference between male and female dominated professions, and we'll talk about what firms can do to protect their women going forward. So quick background is prior to the World War II in the early 1900s, the role of women was to maintain the household and raise the children. The draft of the war brought the era of Rosie the Riveter, where women were going into factories to assist with the supply and demand of war material. This was short-lived for women working in the factories because as the veterans returned to their jobs after the war, many women were forced to return to their household duties because the men needed their jobs back. Post-World War II, was a time of rising opportunity for women. More and more women were graduating from high school. They were continuing their education through postgraduate programs and even seeking collegiate opportunities. Technology started to improve in the mid to late 1900s, which was creating an increased demand for clerical workers, and those were roles that were often filled by women. And that's kind of what initiated the stigma of women needing to have cleaner and safer jobs. They were in office settings as opposed to working in factories. And it started to snowball the stigma we know of women or female dominated occupations today. Some of the Equal Employment Opportunity Acts that came about as women became more noticeable in the workplace. There were more controversial issues that were arising around gender discrimination and pay wages and things like that. One of the first ones that Congress passed was the Equal Pay Act of 1963 that said no employer shall discriminate on the basis of gender by paying wages less than what they pay to the opposite gender. The next one that was passed was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and employers were not allowed to discriminate against hiring any individual on the basis of their race, color, religion, gender, or national origin. And shortly after that was the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, which was actually an amendment to the Civil Rights Act to prohibit discrimination on the basis of pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions when hiring women for workplace positions. Today, how the rise of the global coronavirus pandemic has begun to reinstitute gender-specific roles among families and households. The first members of the workforce that were forced to take on an extra responsibility of remote learning for children were women. Mothers, grandmothers, aunts, and sisters put their careers and their jobs at risk to assume the role of caretaker for both children and even sick elderly family members as well. Women who were fortunate enough to be in a career that still allowed them to continue working during the pandemic were expected by many employers to either transition to a remote environment or to give up their jobs temporarily or permanently to assist in household opportunities. One of the women in the workplace studies that I looked at showed a frightening statistic from 2020 that said 1 in 4 women were considering downshifting in their careers to reduce workload or leaving the workforce altogether. Of these women, the majority of them are senior level management or corporate officers, which to me is frightening to hear because so many women have worked so hard to achieve those roles in the workplace and they've fought so many barriers and overcome so many obstacles. To hear that they are considering downshifting and giving up everything that they've put into their career because of this pandemic is so disheartening, especially to me as a fellow female. Another statistic that was showed in the study I looked at was that women with children were 3 times more likely than fathers to be responsible for a majority of the housework and childcare amid the pandemic. And as a result, many women are starting to experience burnout. Working moms are reporting an additional 20 hours of responsibilities at home during the pandemic, on top of their traditional 40-hour work weeks, and on top of all their other responsibilities that they have outside of their working home lives. Male versus female dominated professions are becoming prominent again in some light. The delineation between male and female dominated occupations is appearing more and more as women lose their jobs during the pandemic. Even though there's been significant progress in recent years towards women entering male dominated professions, there's still large populations of women who are working in what is considered a female occupation. One of the studies I looked at defined a gender-based occupation as male-dominated occupations include engineers, architects, and pilots. Some neutral occupations include accountants, managers, and pharmacists. And female-dominated occupations include bookkeepers, nurses, and secretaries. With that being said, female-dominated occupations were among the first jobs to be furloughed or cut entirely during the pandemic. Many of the industries that suffered the largest impact from the pandemic are the entertainment industry, hospitality, tourism, and a lot of the jobs associated with that are secretaries, administrative assistants, people who are seen as non-essential workers, and a lot of the bodies in those roles were females. So they were the first to be temporarily released or cut from their employers. The United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women had a really interesting statistic that I liked, and it said women are overrepresented in many of the industries hardest hit by COVID-19, such as food service, retail, and entertainment. For example, 40% of all employed women, which is 510 million women globally, work in hard-hit sectors and lost their jobs, compared to 36.6% of all employed men. In a global health crisis, even when the need for nurses, a female quota-dominated profession, is in high demand, the gender wage gap is still reflecting a startling number. The UN Women reported in their report that globally 70% of healthcare workers and first responders are women, and yet they are not at par with their male counterparts. At 28%, the gender pay gap in the health sector is higher than the overall gender pay gap of 16% between male and female workers. So what can companies do to protect their women going forward and prevent the loss of all the progression they've made up to this point? One of the biggest lessons that we have all learned in 2020 is that we have to be flexible and adaptable to change. And like so, companies also need to be flexible and adaptable to the needs of their working women. Firms can reduce the social impact of the pandemic on their female employees by allowing increased flexibility within the workplace to adapt to changes in their home lives. Even with the economy starting to slowly reopen and people returning back to work, there's still a good chance that children are going to be in some sort of part-time or full-time remote distance learning for a little bit longer. So companies being flexible with their policies of women being able to come in later, leave early, something like that will help lessen the burden on their lives at home. Flexible work can mean many other things, such as allowing employees to continue working from home after others return to office, helping them balance hours, and even scheduling key meetings and other important duties around particular times of day. So if mothers are needing to bring their kids to school for a certain time of day, maybe they don't schedule meetings at 9:00 a.m., they could schedule them at like 1:00 in the afternoon to give women that kind of flexibility to be hanging out of the office. Firms also need to just trust their employees during these trying times, especially their female employees who are doing triple duty as full-time worker, mother, and at-home caretaker and/or teacher in this situation. Equivalent leave policies for both mothers and fathers would allow women to spend less time away from the workplace because the responsibilities could be evenly split between parents. So if firms were to look at what their family leave policy says for not only mothers, but for fathers as well, they could lessen the burden a little bit by making those policies equal. It's also important that firms look at their family leave policies and ensure that they are paid family leave policies, because in these present times, it's almost impossible to provide for a family or a household without a consistent and stable source of income coming into the family. So in conclusion, as you can see, while the world is suffering through such an unprecedented time period, women are bearing a heavy burden of trying to balance their work lives and family lives without having to risk losing their careers and all the progress that they have made so far in the working world and the job opportunities that they have also built for themselves. History might be repeating itself as gender roles are slowly creeping back up into workplaces and home lives, and firms can help solve that problem by seeing what they can do to help benefit their women and prevent that from happening. Some further research that other people might look into is investigating the impact of the pandemic on men in the workplace and comparing the results to that of women to determine if there's a disconnect between the genders in the workforce. And here's my bibliography, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Crystal. That was also excellent. We're done. So again, questions for Crystal, you can unmute yourself, or if you want to put something in the chat, I'd be happy to read it. I see a hand from Bruce Thompson.
I was just applauding like everybody else.
Oh, sorry, I thought that was a hand. Are there any questions for Crystal?
No.
Well, I have a question, Crystal. I'm wondering the way in which race and class intersect with this question about gender, and if you had a chance to see any research as to whether the issues that you raised were exacerbated amongst, let's say, women of color, women who are in working class positions as opposed to professional ones. Some of the solutions you mentioned seem like they were probably going to be more likely to be applied to professional women, white collar working women, rather than women in wage jobs or the service sector or something. So did you get a chance to see any of those intersections at all?
I didn't dive deep into it, but I did see a couple of interesting statistics that the more in terms of like secretary positions, administrative assistant positions, that those were typically more women of color than women in like executive level positions that were losing their jobs or stepping down. It was more women of color who did end up losing their jobs and women not of color who ended up stepping down and taking a less time consuming job as like a senior executive or something like that. And it's something that I would love, I think it'd be worth looking into more to see like where that disconnect is, but that was a good question. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions for Crystal?
Hi, Crystal. My name is Lauren Hill from Salisbury University. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much. And one point that you brought up towards your solutions or like ways to cure this was looking at the FMLA policies And it would be interesting too, as a follow-up to your project, to look at how corporations and businesses are encouraging increased paternal participation, and if there are, since we know that women are putting on all of these roles, yes, we're encouraging and we're helping them, but to look at the strategies that other businesses are actually doing for the often the other half of that equation. I thought that was a really important point, and it would be so interesting to see, like you brought up, what are businesses doing for the male end of that. Kind of cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree, and that's that I read another study that kind of alluded to the same fact, that there needs to be more focus on the policies around paternal leave and men having more involvement, lessening the burden on women. And I thought it was a really interesting concept that I'm definitely interested to look into more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the explicit outreach, rather than hoping, right? But that there's explicit encouragement for the dads. So that was great. I thought very important in this discussion.
So Crystal, we also had one question in the chat from Trinity Soto. Trinity says, I was wondering if you saw any mention of trans women or non-gender conforming people, how they fit into this workplace discrimination, since they are usually linked with cisgendered women.
Yeah, thanks, Trinity. I didn't come across anything that specifically said trans women or non-gender women, but I think there was one study I looked at that just kind of lumped them all into the same category of being female versus male, which I didn't necessarily agree with, but it was a source that I ended up throwing away because I didn't like it. So I would be interested to see more about that, if trans women or non-gender women did face a situation where they had to step down to take care of children, as opposed to a male in the workplace.
Great, thank you so much, Crystal. So again, if you have any other questions for Crystal, maybe we can wait to the end if we have a little bit of time, but let's go on to our next presentation. And our next presenter is Bree Schill from Frederick Community College. And Bree's presentation is titled The Racial Wealth Gap in the US, The Path Forward to Equality. All yours, Bree.
Sorry, I'm trying to find out how to share my oh wait, never mind. The button's here. That's on me.
No worries. There you go.
All right. So hi everyone. I'm Bree Schill from Frederick Community College, and my presentation is about the racial wealth gap in the US and just looking at the path forward to equality and what we can do. So today we're going to be talking about structural racism in the United States and how it's created a racial wealth gap through economic policies, which have given way to inequalities in not only education, but inheritance, wages, and home ownership for people of color as well. So just starting off with some evidence of historical discrimination and segregation against Black Americans. Black Americans have been held as slaves for centuries in the United States, and it's said that over $14 trillion in labor was actually extracted by slaveholders. And Black codes were enacted after the Civil War and were so strict in some southern states that Black Americans were fined for working any job besides farming or domestic servitude. And these really ensured the availability of Black Americans as a cheap labor force. And eventually, Black codes were replaced by Jim Crow laws because in 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson case established the law of separate but equal, basically legalizing segregation. And in the 20th century, New Deal policies like the Fair Labor Standards Act were created to protect the labor force. However, Black workers were largely excluded from the FLSA because it didn't include many domestic, agricultural, or service occupations. And this exclusion of Black Americans only created larger disparities between white and Black wages and benefits. And even today, Many Black Americans remain in low-paying, low-benefit jobs as a result of these policies. Another organization created by New Deal policies called the Federal Housing Administration has also had huge impacts on housing disparities, which we will further address later. And these moments in history are only a few examples of the US government discriminating against and excluding Black Americans in its policies. So fast forward to today, there are still huge disadvantages and disparities between Black and white Americans. And first, we'll be looking at disparities in education. So the college dropout rate for Black students is actually the highest of any other racial group, with a 6-year completion rate of only 38.9% compared to the 64.8% completion rate for whites. And Black students also owe more compared to other students. They borrow around $21,149 on average, which is actually twice as much as white students. And 21% of Black students with a bachelor's degree actually default on their school loans, which is over 5 times the rate of their white peers. And these disparities in completion rate and debt between Blacks and whites comes as no surprise. Blacks often come from families with little to no college experience, have lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and they graduate from underperforming high schools that don't prepare them well for college. And Black students are even disadvantaged after graduating from college. They only earn around 82.4 cents for every dollar that their white peers make. And the unemployment rate for Black graduates between the ages of 25 and 34 is also 2/3 higher than other graduates of similar ages. And recently, low-income college students, many of which are Black, have been making headlines due to dropping enrollment numbers for this past fall semester. Students are facing difficulties with not only paying for school due to job losses, but just with dealing with the pandemic as well, which has actually hit Black communities the hardest of any racial group. And Black students have suffered the biggest decline in enrollment this year, especially at community colleges where enrollment rates are actually down 11%. So the wealth gap between Blacks and whites in 2016 is roughly the same as in 1962, which raises the question, what makes this gap so persistent? And a lot of people have a lot of differing opinions about the source of this gap, but we're going to be looking at disparities in all different aspects of wealth between Blacks and whites, including income, liquid assets, and inheritances. So as I previously stated, Blacks with the same educational attainment as their white peers only make around 82 cents for every dollar that their white peers make. However, this doesn't really explain as to why the wealth of whites is 5 to 10 times the wealth of Blacks. I think that the persistence of the wealth and income gaps between Black and white Americans could be pretty much due to historical racism and the growing income inequality in America as a whole. So Dionisi Alaprantis and Daniel Carroll actually estimated that if the income inequality between Blacks and whites had been eliminated in 1962, the median Black family wealth would have been 90% of the median white family wealth by 2007. However, if current trends persist, it will actually take 259 years for the wealth of Black men to reach 90% of the wealth of white men. And you can see in this chart right here that the labor income gap really plays a huge role in the overall wealth gap. And eliminating that income inequality, as you can see from that research, it would really allow for a lot of wealth accumulation for Black families over the years. And also the growing concentration of wealth among the top income earners in the US over the last 50 years has played a huge part in lower and middle income Black and white families in the US to lose income in relation to the richest Americans. So next, moving on to liquid assets. The mean liquid assets for Black families have a value of around $8,700 compared to the $49,500 that white family has. And that could be partially explained by the fact that only 34% of Black families have a retirement account, while 60% of white families do. And since many Black Americans hold lower paying occupations, they may not even have enough extra income to be able to put away money into a retirement account. And you can see in this graph that the retirement account value, the disparities between Black and white retirement account values only grows as age increases. So next, looking at inheritances, around 26% of white households receive an inheritance compared to the only 8% of Black families that do. And the inheritances of white households are larger on average, with the median white inheritance being almost $20,000 greater than that of Black families. And aside from monetary inheritances, intergenerational transfers of homeownership greatly add to the racial wealth gap, because only 40% of Black families own homes compared to the 73% of white families that do. And homes are often the largest asset a family has, and owning a house is a really great contributor to wealth. And when Black families do own homes, they're often in lower income neighborhoods where the houses are less likely to appreciate in value. And much of this inequity in housing can be shown as a lasting result of the Federal Housing Administration, which was created by the New Deal in 1934. And the FHA really made it clear that they did not want to provide housing to Black Americans. In its manual, it actually stated that it was risky to make mortgage loans in areas that were predominantly Black, and even denied insurance to a builder who wanted to build a neighborhood in a predominantly Black area. And the FHA really only focused on housing for white Americans and tried to avoid integration at all costs. And redlining actually came from this period in time where the red lines on maps would outline predominantly Black areas and neighborhoods that were considered hazardous to give out loans around. And while its origins are in the past, housing segregation is still very real today, because many Black families still live in crowded metropolitan areas with low property value, while areas with higher property values, like the suburbs, are predominantly white. And these disparities in housing make it near impossible for Black families to build intergenerational wealth. So from my research, it is really obvious that the racial wealth gap is a huge issue in the US and that we must find ways to close this gap. So I've just come up with a couple suggestions that may help to begin to close the racial wealth gap, including equalizing education and improving housing options. So starting off with equalizing education, I do think that middle schools and high schools that are predominantly Black should really be provided that proper funding. And while I know taxation does fund schools, I think some schools that are really struggling should be provided extra funding. And even if they are already being given extra funding, they should just really have all the help that they can get from their local and just state governments. I also think making Black families aware of programs like child savings accounts could really help. Just having that peace of mind that their child's college education could be partially paid for by something like that would really help. Also, increasing the grants available for Black students for college could really just help these students kind of feel like they could make their way through college and not be afraid of having to pay for it or anything like that. And also just increasing the communication that Black high school students have with colleges, just colleges, again, letting them know about the financial aspect and all the opportunities they could have to have their schooling paid for. But ultimately, the pretty much most important way we could equalize education is just to make everything an even playing field by eliminating private education, just so no one really has a step above anyone else or anything like that. So then looking at improving housing, I think that stricter anti-discrimination laws in the housing market should be enforced, as well as creating more low to middle income housing for Black families, just to try and erase the effects of redlining, try and diversify areas more. And also creating more opportunities for homeownership that aren't in low income areas could really help build that generational wealth for Black families. And being able to pass on that wealth is really crucial in increasing the overall wealth of Black families. And it really is time for them to be given this opportunity to begin to accumulate wealth and for us to try and close the racial wealth gap. And sources.
Thank you so much, Bree. Excellent work. Questions for Bree? Okay, yeah, Sifa.
Great presentation, Bree. So I know you focused on, in terms of solutions, equalizing education and improving housing, which I think both are super important, but you also had the focus on wealth, which I think all of this kind of, I guess, stems back to. So I guess my question is really, what way in which do you think this change could occur? Like, do you think it's going to be through government laws or through like individual like realtors and I guess businesses making that change? Which do you think would be more feasible and more impactful? And same with education, like should it be the government or should individual schools do their own thing?
I definitely feel like it should be the responsibility of the government to try and fix this issue since they pretty much were the ones that caused it. And I just feel like they would have the most overall impact as well, just because they can control like many different schools and housing markets at once, that kind of thing.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So Bree, I have a question. What about the idea of reparations as a kind of direct transfer of wealth? Did you look at that all in your research? And do you think that that's a kind of a feasible path forward for trying to close the racial wealth gap?
I didn't actually look into that too much in my research, but I do think that could be a good option for trying to equalize things.
It's one that's obviously quite controversial and maybe very difficult to implement in one way, but it seems to be getting there's more discussion, I think, surrounding it in recent years. The other thing I'd point out too is just that connection between education and housing, right? Because we have a system in which we have neighborhood schools. So where you live is like often generally determinative of what school you go to. And so those two issues that you identified are deeply connected in some profound ways. Other questions for Bree, either in the chat or again, feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, Bree. This is Mary Ellen King. And I've been doing some studying on the Boston area. And what you say about redlining and also blockbusting is just an enormous factor up there in the past that's had a radical effect on the people who are now living in Boston. And primarily that's a minority neighborhood or a minority city at this point. So my question would be, what do you think about an advisory committee that when you're going to buy a house, you can go to them and try to eliminate some of the predatory lending and other things that happen when people buy a home?
I did actually look into predatory lending and all of those things, and I think that would really make a huge impact if there were just stricter kind of rules just in the housing market and that kind of thing to just try and discourage all of that from happening. And just, I really think diversifying neighborhoods would make a huge impact and just kind of erasing like the stigma around like Black neighborhoods, basically, like that are redlined, that are seen as like bad areas. I think just, again, erasing that predatory lending and all of those kinds of things would be huge.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much again, Bree. And it's time to turn it over to our last presenter for the session. Chibuzo Opaigbeogu is at Salisbury University, and his presentation is entitled "Success for Everyone in Small Businesses: The Best Practices in Engaging Collaborative Networks, as a small business. Take it away.
Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chibuzo Opaigbeogu. I am a first-year student of the Glenda Chatham and Robert G. Clark Honors College at Salisbury University in Salisbury, Maryland. I'm currently majoring in information systems in our Purdue School of Business. The title of my presentation is Success for Everyone in Small Business. My goal for today's presentation is to tell you about collaborative networks and some of the best practices for small businesses to engage in collaborative networks. To start us off, let me present you with this fact. According to a report by the United States Small Business Administration in 2012, almost 50% of small businesses fail within their first 5 years of operation. I'll say that again for emphasis. Almost 50% of small businesses fail within their first 5 years of operation. If this alarms you, unfortunately, I have to say you're in the right place. That's why we're here today. How do we reduce this number? Before we get to the solution, allow me to build on this information. According to the same agency in 2018, small businesses employ the majority of the United States workforce. These failing small businesses can cause a significant concern regarding job security for a large population of the United States workforce. This high failure rate of small businesses is due to a lack of resources and support. Research supports that collaborative networks can increase the likelihood of long-term success for small businesses. Now we can move forward to solving this issue. To begin, we need to define what collaborative networks are. In 2008, Sorensen, Folker, and Brigham defined collaborative networks as networks of collaborative relationships that concern a business or organization. The authors continue to inform readers that these networks can include customers, employees, family, and community members, as well as other businesses. Now, this definition can seem pretty open-ended, and that is completely by design. Scholars like Chibuzo and his colleagues in 2012 state that collaborative networks are extremely flexible. These networks can be set up in a way that benefits all parties in the networks, usually to the benefit of businesses and organizations. Also, collaborative networks can be formed through formal contractual relationships or informal relations, citing Wolf and Boutel in 2017. And these can be either temporary or permanent, citing Chibuzo and others in 2012. This further enforces the point that these networks are flexible. Now that there's a general idea of what a collaborative network is, I can give you some examples of these networks in the real world. A study completed by Levy in 2007 that was cited in an article by Reyna in 2012 states that there was an increase of 63% of corporations in the United States software industry that engaged in alliances or collaborative networks between the start and end of the 1990s. The research presented in that study shows a higher potential of access to new information, sharing or minimizing risk, as well as increased access to resources and skills. A 2011 case study completed by Chibuzo and his colleagues in the fashion industry concluded that collaborative networks, quote, increase the potential to respond to market opportunities quickly and efficiently, end quote. These networks were able to pool their resources and analyze the current business environment to anticipate upcoming opportunities. I think it's safe to say that this can work in the reverse. These networks can and are being used to anticipate upcoming negative events. There are numerous others, including a few more that I've researched, but for the sake of time, I'll move to the next point. So now that it's been established that collaborative networks exist and are effective in producing characteristics that lead to success for small business in the real world today, what are some general benefits that small businesses can expect by engaging in them? Collaborative networks and relationships are known for resource and knowledge sharing that occurs within the network, as stated by Wolf and Boutel in 2017. Many small businesses consider knowledge as a central resource which makes sense considering that the main reason that small business fail is a lack of knowledge. With the knowledge and resource gained from collaborative networks, small businesses can turn their attention towards innovation. This innovation allows for more competition in the economy, which is almost always a good thing. This conclusion was originally made by Lorenzoni and Bain and Fuller in 1995, cited by Wolf and Beutel in 2017. Small businesses are also starting to realize that they cannot remain fully independent. This suggestion was made by Chibuzo and his colleagues in 2012. Just like people need interaction with other people to live life, businesses need interaction with other organizations to be successful. In larger collaborative networks, such as those that develop within geographic regions, the potential to respond to opportunities quickly and efficiently increases significantly. Smaller collaborative networks can be made up of people in varying roles, such as family, friends, community members, and other individuals. This allows businesses to gain stakeholders who contribute more to the business and collaborative network. This conclusion was based in an article by Sorensen, Folker, and Brigham in 2008. Collaborative networks, just like many other aspects of our lives, no longer solely exist face-to-face. These networks can, and now are, often mediated through technology and the internet. I'm sure networks like these are appreciated during the pandemic. We've seen how important it is for people and businesses to remain connected despite physical and social distancing. These electronic collaborative networks have many benefits of their own. Michaelides and their colleagues stated in 2012 that collaborators in electronic networks have some unique benefits of their own, including opportunities to access new information from their sector, industry, or even the government. Collaborators also noted some additional benefits that are seemingly simple, like access to online network activities and partnerships in professional specialist networks. Now that everyone is well acquainted with the concept of collaborative networks, how they are used, and what their benefits are, I can give my recommendations for the best practices to engage in them based on my research. The first recommendation for small businesses is to get involved in collaborative networks. At this point, it may seem redundant to say this, but I think it's a necessary point. There are so many small businesses trying to succeed on their own, which is the main reason small businesses are failing. The second recommendation is for small businesses to not limit their collaborative networks. If someone is truly willing to engage in your collaborative network, allow them to do so. By allowing a diverse group of entities, there will be a diverse set of perspectives and viewpoints. This may bring attention to something that you would have missed without their input. Dzifa was speaking earlier about Black Lives Matter, which is an example of a community organization that can be included in collaborative networks. This can also help with reducing the racial wealth gap that Bree presented on earlier. Even Crystal's topic of women in the workplace fits in here. Community organizations for women can help work towards their goals within collaborative networks as well. That's what all these different topics have in common. They all need to work together. The third recommendation is actually from the article Sorensen, Folker, and Brigham in 2008, which says small businesses should, quote, obtain resources without becoming overly dependent on others, end quote. This just means that small businesses should be actively engaged in their collaborative networks, but in the process, ensure that if the relationship were to end, the business would still be able to succeed in the long term. I think that if small businesses follow these basic recommendations, the business will be taking a step in the right direction towards obtaining long-term business success. However, I do want to reiterate the point that collaborative networks are flexible. Small businesses should find a collaborative network that fits the interests of their own company. If none exist, small business owners and/or managers should create one that fits the needs and interests of their own business. With all that being said, some people may still be skeptical about collaborative networks. These networks often require trust, which is hard to give out at times. Often people will find ways to exploit others, and this can certainly be true for collaborative networks. To avoid these, there are two recommendations that I can put forward. The first is to assess the concern you have for yourself or your small business, as well as the concern you have for others or your relationship for others. First things first, if you have a low concern for both your business and others' businesses and organizations, you probably shouldn't be running a small business. If you have a high concern for only your small business, you're likely competitive. If you have a high concern for only others' businesses and organizations, you're likely accommodating. Finally, if you have a high concern for both your business and others' businesses and organizations, you are likely collaborative. Anything in between these traits is described as compromising. This list of traits was adopted from a figure in an article by Sorensen, Volker, and Brigham in 2008. If you are anything besides collaborative or compromising, I would highly suggest you find an alternative method to reaching long-term success for your small business. While I do believe collaborative networks are one of the best options for reaching business success, it's certainly not the only method. My second recommendation is to build and maintain trust among all members of the collaborative network. Following this recommendation reduces any possible likelihood of a member engaging in malicious activity within the network. Usually, by the time trust has been established between most network members, any potential malicious activity will become evident. The occurrence of malicious activity among one or more network members is a potential risk that correlates with business decisions like this. It should not be something that prohibits a business from taking part in a collaborative network. In conclusion, collaborative networks are great resources for small businesses struggling to stay relevant and competitive in today's business world. They provide the knowledge and resources needed for small businesses to succeed in the long term. Small businesses should aim to create or engage in diverse collaborative networks for the best likelihood for success. Small businesses should also avoid becoming overly dependent on any external source. These businesses should also make sure the network fits their needs, as well as contributing to other members. Using these recommendations, we can reduce the percentage of failing small businesses in our nation and increase job security for those currently employed by those small businesses. Here are the references I used during this presentation, and I truly thank you for attending my presentation and taking the time to listen.
Thank you so much, Chibuzo. Again, round of applause. And questions for our last presenter. There was actually, let me read one that was in the chat sort of halfway through your presentation, which I think you addressed a little bit, but maybe want an opportunity to talk about a little bit more. Samantha Lance asked, do you have some tips for one to open a small business, especially during the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a pretty loaded question because small businesses can come in many different formats. There's two main things that I would say on that topic. During the pandemic, I've seen a lot of people who are opening online focused small businesses because they can do that from anywhere. They can operate from a lot of places and it gives them much more flexibility. But one of the main things that I focused on in this presentation is just to make sure you're not doing it alone. Whether you're bringing in community members, family, friends, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to make all the business decisions with them, but you need that support. Doing it by yourself rarely works, as we've seen so many times. 50% is a huge number. So making sure you have that people in your support group to help you during tough times, or even just to get it started.
Great, thank you. Other questions for Chibuzo? So I'll ask a question then, if the people don't want to. This idea of networks, I think, is fascinating. And in some of my own research, which is totally unrelated to business, but involves something called social network analysis, which is like a really specific kind of methodology you use, sort of a quantitative methodology to analyze the relationship between different entities within a network. And I'm wondering if the research that you read, did it apply like network analysis specifically, or were they just talking about networks in a more kind of metaphorical, like the people you're connected to sort of sense?
This was definitely more the metaphorical sense. It was focused on the concept of just getting involved, because I think a lot of people miss that simple fact, and it's so essential. But I think it just goes back to like not having the knowledge for it. Network analysis is definitely a great area that I should look for like further research, because I think that would be helpful. And using that network analysis, it can like help create better collaborative networks for those who are already engaged and stuff like that.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend sort of checking it out and seeing if you can apply this particular method to what you're talking about. Because I you know, without again knowing a lot about that particular area, I think you could probably, you have to sort of specifically identify certain characteristics or elements that you would see connected and what the relationships are. but it might provide some interesting empirical support for the arguments that you're trying to make.
Definitely. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Similar to that, the idea of networking there, another thing that you might look at to explore is the way that local governments and small city governments or like a chamber of commerce can help facilitate these collaborative networks, you know, and for example, small cities like Salisbury, you know, we really have a sense of urgency to protect and grow our small businesses. You know, that's one of our city level goals, right? And so it'd be interesting to look at then how is the city facilitating this and how are they helping to create these networks for people who would like to be involved. You know, that might be another fun twist to explore.
Yeah, and I think that was an area that I touched on early in my research. I don't think it was in this presentation, but those like small city organizations are really like important because they cross like industry boundaries. Oftentimes people will be in a collaborative network that's like, okay, we're only talking about tech here, but it's important to even get the perspectives from other industries because they can help you with much more than you realize, and certain topics can be applied across industries. So
yeah, awesome.
What I particularly liked about your presentation, Chibuzo, is the fact that you still talk about self-reliance, that isn't completely discounted. And that led me to think about all of the presentations today, which in some way dispel this myth of this uniquely American myth that if the individual only works hard enough, he or she will succeed. And each of you in your own way touched on the importance of community and the reinforcement of a different kind or a rethinking of the social contract. So I commend you all for that, that notion of working together and collaboration. I thought it was really a fantastic panel.
Thank you, Dean Martino.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for kind of tying that all together at the end here. We have a couple of minutes left. Does anyone else want to ask a question to Chibuzo or any of our presenters that we heard today?
I have a quick question for Bree on, so when you were talking about in your presentation how white people can start to live in Black communities or predominantly Black communities, how do you make sure that gentrification doesn't occur so then the Black communities are driven out of the community they created?
That's a great question. I actually thought about that myself when making my project. My thought is that if a lot of people can live together that have around like the same income, that kind of thing, because I know gentrification often happens when more like rich people come into an area and kind of start building new developments and that kind of thing. But I think if, say, it was more low to middle income families all wanted to live in one area, I think that would probably be the way to go about it, just to have everything be like kind of like all the houses be like an equal price where people can buy it if they have enough money, that kind of thing, but not like selling things to other people to kind of develop, you know?
All right. I think we probably have time for one more question if anyone has one. All right, then I will just again reiterate Dean Martino's comments that what an excellent session this was. I am so impressed by our 4 presenters today. So thank you, all of you. Thanks to everyone who attended on this Saturday morning. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the conference. Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you again.